Welcome, Claudia. Welcome, Brenda. Welcome, Corinne and Nicola.
Hello, Judy.
Hi.
Again, we're just waiting for some more people to join the session, but welcome to all of you. It's wonderful to have you all with us this evening for our talk with Rabbi Lea Mühlstein. We're just waiting perhaps 4 or 5 more minutes.
Absolutely, and it's a pleasure. It's one of the few times, I think, Adrian, that I was introduced at an English synagogue with my name pronounced correctly, my surname. Doesn't happen so often. I've lived in England for such a long time. I'm hardly used to hearing it pronounced like that anymore.
It has its advantages and disadvantages. Here in the synagogue, sometimes also are reminded that we're not pronouncing a name in a German way. But it comes with the heritage. As always, also please feel free when you have some questions you want to ask Rabbi Lea, or in general, something you want to raise as a question or a topic, you can use the live chat of YouTube or in Zoom. We're monitoring both, and we'll make sure that we'll dedicate some time at the end to answer your questions or addressing those concerns, issues you have. And I think when something urgent comes up, Rabbi Lea is for sure also able and willing to answer immediately. She is a congregational rabbi, so she knows that sometimes things are very important and need to be addressed immediately.
Absolutely. And also, you can interrupt me because I'm also a Zionist politician, and believe me, I'm quite used to being interrupted. So don't hesitate, especially if something isn't clear that I'm saying and you want some clarification, then just do come in and interrupt me.
Maybe while we're waiting, could you tell us something about your congregation in North London?
Sure, absolutely. So we've just renamed ourselves. So we used to be called the Northwood and Pinner Liberal Synagogue because we are in Northwood, and we used to have Pinner contacts. So now we're the Ark Synagogue, but we are still really the Northwood and Pinner Liberal Synagogue. Yeah. So as that, you probably know us, maybe. So we're the second largest liberal synagogue. Two full-time rabbis, myself and Rabbi Aaron Goldstein, have about 750 families in membership, and quite a large catchment area. Now, primarily, one of the reasons why we changed our name is that we observed over the last 10 years that hardly any of our new membership is actually living in Northwood or in Pinner, but are actually more living in Three Rivers, Rickmansworth, Chorley Wood area, Watford. So we're kind of more catching the outskirts of London than the London boroughs of where Northwood and Pinner are. Although we still have quite a number of members in Northwood and Pinner. And yeah, pretty much we're like a fairly standard large synagogue with everything that large synagogues kind of have. Cheder, although sadly still online. And we have a care coordinator doing lots of care work for our people. So yeah, just a lovely community. And I always say I'm in congregational bliss. I've been there for now for over 7 years. And it's a wonderful community, very harmonious, and a great privilege to be able to serve there.
And how was COVID for the synagogue? I mean, how, Zoom services and so on, that worked well?
So we were really fortunate that we had 2 volunteers in the congregation, one who had a business of videography and sound stuff for theaters and who was out of business with COVID and therefore had lots of time to volunteer in the shul, and another volunteer who runs a business that does streaming for sporting events. So they've been wonderful and given us lots and lots of advice. So it's been quite incredible. Like, we just looked back at what has been our journey, and we did pretty quickly quite a leap. So and we've been lucky, we've been able to stream from the sanctuary throughout. We have a very good relationship with our local police also, and always liaised with them, and had just us 2 rabbis in the sanctuary for quite a long time. But so we've been able to be in the sanctuary for the whole period. Yeah, it's had its challenges. I mean, I think the most difficult age group are actually the teenagers. They really hate the experience of online, especially when they were online for school as well. They don't want to turn their cameras on. They're self-conscious. But everyone else has coped surprisingly well. There's a small cohort that are struggling. But yeah, we made the best of it. What can you do?
Wonderful. I think that already gave a little bit a taste of who is our guest this evening, but let's just give myself the quick opportunity to welcome officially all of you to our talk this evening, which is a joint talk by the South London Israel Forum together with the Wimbledon Synagogue, and to welcome Rabbi Lea Mühlstein, from a congregational rabbi, as we just heard, from the north of London, so from the other side of the river. And in my 7 months here or 8 months here in London, I've learned already that these are 2 different worlds. Yeah, it's wonderful to have Rabbi Mühlstein with us this evening. There are many reasons why we have Rabbi Mühlstein with us and to talk to us. One of the really important factors is that she represents an organization that is also very close and dear to my heart, and that also brings the 2 of us together, because we were both active in the early years of Arzenu in Deutschland, in Germany. And we're both sitting in the first board of Arzenu in Germany, when it was founded as an important answer or an important voice in the Zionist landscape of Germany, because a voice for progressive, reform, liberal Jews to express their specific idea of Zionism and their Zionist dreams were often not heard or even known, that there is a different voice that enriches Zionist views and a Zionist vision for the state of Israel. So at that time, when it was founded, we were both members of the congregation in Munich, And perhaps also one of the anecdotes with Rabbi Lea Mühlstein was that she was also heading Tamar, and Tamar is the young adults reform Zionist youth organization or young adults organization, which in Germany starts at Jung und Jüdisch, and there was a significant question about is it Zionist or not, and I think Rabbi Lea was one of the people who really fought hard to also to bring in a Zionist or the Zionist perspective in the work of young adults, young Jewish adults. So Rabbi Lea Mühlstein, as you can see from my first introductional words, is also from Germany, was born and raised in Germany. Her family are very significant players in the progressive movement and in the re-establishing progressive Reform Judaism in Germany. And she was, I think her bat mitzvah was is published in several books, or the picture of her bat mitzvah. So there was always a little bit of position for her that was elevated above those from other congregants and members of the Reform movement. And perhaps that was already why she became then a rabbi as a second choice. First, she thought she will enter the world of the Big Bang Theory people and heading for the Nobel Prize for chemistry. But we just ruled that out. It is perhaps not in the near future. So she decided to earn her living becoming a rabbi. She studied at Leo Baeck, was ordained in 2012 by the Leo Baeck College, and as she just outlined a little bit, so she is a rabbi of the Ark Synagogue, or Northwood and Pinner Liberal Synagogue in the north of London, one of the two senior rabbis there. And in her rare time, she is heading Arzenu, the international and national organization for progressive reform liberal Zionism. And we thought for this evening that Rabbi Lea Mühlstein will first give you a little bit an idea what Arzenu is and what its aims are, and then she will give you a perspective on current Israel affairs with the new government in establishing or how it establishes itself, and then also will look at specific reform progressive questions when it comes to Zionism and Israel today. So welcome, Rabbi Lea, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this introduction. It's really wonderful. I didn't really have to write a little bio for you because you kind of know it anyway. It's really wonderful to be here with you. I'm sorry that I'm not there in person. It would be lovely. I look forward to coming to Wimbledon again. The last time actually I came to Wimbledon was quite a long time ago. I came as a rabbinic student. I did a couple of services, I think, or maybe just one. I can't remember now. As a rabbinic student at Wimbledon. But today I'm here actually not so much talking about my rabbinic role, but talking about the political role which I have in my function as the international chair of Arzenu. Many of you might not be familiar with Arzenu. It's one of, I always say, it's one of the well-kept secrets of the progressive Jewish world that we do indeed have a political party that represents our interests in Israel. We do not have a political party that runs in the Knesset, but we do have a political party that represents the interests of Reform, progressive, and liberal Zionists in what is called the national institutions. The national institutions, some of which you're probably the names will be more familiar, others will not be so familiar, were the institutions that were founded by the Jewish people, starting with Herzl in really trying to set up the state of Israel. So first, the first of the organizations that was established was the World Zionist Organization. It was actually first established as the Zionist Organization, and then changed its name to the World Zionist Organization. And that was established by Theodor Herzl at the first Zionist Congress. Very soon, the Zionist political movement understood that it didn't just need one organization, but that it made sense to have kind of different departments, so to speak. And it started to create daughter organizations. The first of which was the Jewish Agency for Israel, which is still an organization in the Jewish world. It's changed a little bit the relationship with the World Zionist Organization. It used to be 100% daughter of the World Zionist Organization, completely controlled by the World Zionist Organization. These days, it's controlled 50% by the World Zionist Organization and 50% by the people representing donors to the Jewish Agency. You're probably most familiar with the Jewish Agency as they handle Aliyah, immigration to Israel, but also the Jewish Agency is the provider that organizes Birthright and year programs like Masa. It is the largest non-governmental organization in Israel. It has a budget of about $750 million. So it's a major player in Israel. Not as well known is that it is, for example, the largest provider of social housing in Israel. And a lot of the work for Holocaust survivors, for example, is done by the Jewish Agency. So Jewish Agency is one of those bodies. Then thirdly, the Jewish National Fund, Keren Kayemet L'Yisrael, was established as one of the national institutions. You're probably familiar with the little pushkis, the blue boxes, where we were all asked to donate our money to buy trees in Israel. It really was in the early days, it was really the organization that bought private land in Israel for the settlement of Jews. So even before the state of Israel was founded, and a lot of the time, a lot of the big political controversies that happen around the work of the national institution happen linked to Keren Kayemet L'Yisrael, the Jewish National Fund, because some of the land it owns is in areas that are in controversial areas. Let's put it like this. I always like to talk about these areas being the disputed areas, because what we can all agree on is that we have a dispute about them, whether we call them the occupied territories, whether we call it Judea or Samaria. What we can all agree on, whether we are left-wingers or right-wingers, is that we have a dispute about them. So I like to talk about these areas as disputed territories. So a lot of the land that is owned in those areas by Keren Kayemet L'Yisrael actually was purchased before the state of Israel was even established. So it's not as easy as sometimes is portrayed of Jewish land grab after the establishment of the state, but was bought a long time before anyone imagined the Six-Day War happening. The other areas that are often where there are contentious situations around Keren Kayemet L'Yisrael is the rights of Bedouin to land, and that's primarily in the south of Israel, because most of the land in the north of Israel, there were good agreements made with the Bedouin families. Those agreements were never really reached in the south, and some of the disputes happened there as well. So that's also one of the national institutions. Keren Kayemet L'Yisrael remains until this day 100% daughter organization of the World Zionist Organization. And then finally, the fourth player is Keren HaYesod. In the UK, it's the UJIA that represents Keren HaYesod. It's basically the fundraising arm of the movement. in the United States, it's the federations of North America, the Jewish federations of North America. Around the world, rest of the world, it tends to be just Keren Hayesod. So those are the national institutions. And what the reform movement realized about 35, 40 years ago was that the reform movement didn't have a say in the political discussions at the Knesset in the state of Israel, because we were a very small minority in those days in the state of Israel, and we didn't have a political party and there's been a lot of debate, maybe we should have a political party, but I'm actually one of the people who says, well, maybe we shouldn't have a political party, because just like in England or in Germany or wherever we are in the world, actually individuals choose to affiliate with a progressive synagogue because of their choice of how they wish to pray, not because they necessarily agree globally on politics in the state. So just like we have in our congregations in the UK, members voting for a different political party, the same is true in Israel, and it remains true until this day. In fact, there was a survey done not so long ago, which showed that about 30% of, almost 30% of reform movement members had voted for the Likud. So this conception that, reform automatically must mean one political party left wing is simply not correct when we look at the congregational scenario. But what the reform movement realized is it didn't have a political voice in the state, and it had missed out in the negotiations when the state was founded, because most liberal and reform Jews at the time were not very active in the Zionist movement. And therefore, when the deal was made between Ben Gurion and the Orthodox about matters of religion and state, there simply wasn't anyone progressive around to say, actually, hang on, we don't want Orthodox monopoly. So we had missed out at the time because we were not involved. And later on, rabbis started to say, actually, we need to be politically involved. If we want to have a voice, we need to be politically involved. If we cannot, or if we think we should not have a party in the Knesset, then we should have a political party in these Zionist institutions, because these Zionist institutions run elections like you do for countries. Every 5 years, there are elections to the Zionist Congress, which sets the power balance in these institutions. So the reform movement said we should be part of this. In this country, probably the most outspoken supporter of the idea was Rabbi Dov Marmor, who was at Aleph Gardens at the time, who was very, very instrumental in establishing what in the UK was known as ProZion. So ProZion is, and they've sort of renamed themselves to Arzenu UK, although they didn't rename the bank account. ProZion was established as the UK constituent of Arzenu, is a member in the Zionist Federation, and participates. So this representation was to give us a voice at the table, an equal voice at the table in political discussions, and partly that was to achieve wins on issues that we cared about, and I will come to some of those discussions in a little bit later when we're looking at the new government as well. But also absolutely instrumental. Why it was so instrumental that we were sitting as equal partners at this table was that it allowed the reform movement to establish relationships with Israeli politicians, because at that table, we sit as equal partners with the Likud, with Avodah, with Israel Beitenu, and it allowed us to establish relationships with key politicians to then also push for our issues in the Knesset. So it kind of had a double effect. Arzenu also has the role, we always talk about a twofold mission. So I've talked a lot about the first part of the mission already, which is the representation of our values and interests in the national institutions. The second part is really a more local part, which is the idea that through our national constituents, and we now have constituents in 18 countries around the world, through those constituents, we promote Zionism and Israel within our congregations. That happens more or less always dependent a little bit on the local leadership and how much they can put up and organize and make events happen. It's certainly the area where in the UK we have a little bit of work to do, that we haven't done very much in terms of working really with individual congregations. It's partly to do with the fact that there's no staff member, everyone is a volunteer, and that's been a bit of a struggle. But the idea was that meant also that in cross-communal events, when we talk about Israel, we don't just talk about it from the perspective of secular Jews or the perspective of United Synagogue Jews, but we also talk about Israel from the perspective of Reform and Liberal Jews. So this is why ProZion was founded. I'm going to take a short moment to give you an opportunity to ask some questions about Arzenu, because then I'm going to move on to the new Israeli government and what all of this might mean for us. So if there are any questions of clarification, then now would be a good time to jump in. Wonderful. If you need to think a little bit about it. Yeah, sure, Claudia.
But my sort of impression is that in Israel, when they talk about left and right, they use left to represent secular, not necessarily progressive Judaism, but secular, and right to represent religious, much more than sort of economic left and right. So, so it is a bit surprising for you to say that 30% of progressive Jews in Britain, if that's what you said.
No, not in Britain, in Israel, progressive Jews in Israel.
Would actually vote Likud. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a bit surprising.
It is surprising. So what's very tricky about Israeli politics is that left and right is very complicated, and there are many different things that categorize left and right. So one thing about left and right is often you can by asking someone, where is Hebron, depending on what their answer is, you can say, are you a left winger or are you a right winger? Do you say it's, it's part of Judea and Samaria, or do you say it's the West Bank, or do you say it's the occupied territories? That's your first definition of left to right. So your position in the conflict is one place of left to right. There is the left to right divide of secular versus religious, although some of what I would actually define as right-wing parties in terms of some of their other policies, for example, on Judea and Samaria, are secular. So we'll talk a bit about Israel Beitenu, for example, which is very clearly secular, but also very clearly pro-settlement. Yeah. Then there is, and then there are the divides, which in most other countries would be the divides between right and left, which is about welfare state, the economy, investment in security, those kind of things. So it does. The left-right divide in Israel is very complicated and doesn't work so neatly. So you're right, but a lot of Israeli voting is also, Israelis seem to have almost no party loyalty. Most people that I know,
even the leaders,
yeah, you can swap parties like from one election to the next. I mean, and sometimes you run in this party. I think Naftali Bennett has only been in politics for 8 years, and I think he's been in 5 political parties already.
Exactly.
So in Israel, there's parties. Parties come, parties go. You join this one, you join that one. You join a joint list. You do so. It's a little bit complicated. So when we say people were voting for Likud, that's partly also because Bibi Netanyahu actually oftentimes had like the reputation of being the only one who could be prime minister. Nobody really believed that there was anyone else who had the stuff to be prime minister.
Mm-hmm.
And that was part of the challenge that we saw in Israeli politics. So some of the people who said, well, I voted for the Likud, might have voted for the Likud because they felt, well, we're going to have a right-wing government anyway, so at least I want Benjamin Netanyahu as the prime minister because he's a strong personality. In the Middle East, you need strong personalities in order to succeed. So let's just vote for the Likud. Also has a lot of recognition, right? A lot of the other parties that didn't necessarily have that. So it's complicated. All of these things are always complicated when it comes to Israel. I'm going to talk a little bit about the new government and then what it means for our issues. But do keep asking questions if you want to, and in the chat, and also just interrupt me. I want to share my screen for a moment because I think it's helpful to just see a few pictures. Do we have a new Israeli government? It's a good question. At the moment, there is an announcement that there will be a vote on Sunday on swearing in on voting on and then swearing in a new Israeli government. The picture that you just see in front of you is probably going to be the historic picture of this government, which is a picture of, you see, let me just get my little laser pointer. Here, sitting here is Yair Lapid. And we'll talk a little bit more about him in a moment, of Yesh Atid. Then we have Naftali Bennett of Yamina, toward the right. This is Mansour Abbas of RAM, the Arab list. It is the most unlikely picture. Yamina to the right was known as a pro-settlement party, very much representing the settler bloc. Although Naftali Bennett himself has never lived on a settlement, he has a very nice mansion in Ra'anana. He's a tech millionaire. He has no tech knowledge apparently, but he was a sort of career entrepreneur and made his fortune in that. But very clearly, right-wing pro-settlement used to represent the settler movement. And Mansour Abbas, an Islamist, not a moderate Arab, not what many maybe expected, which is the joint list, which is the much more Ayman Odeh, much more moderate Arabs. No, the Islamists. These 3 men, they were not the only ones to sign the coalition agreement, but this is them signing the coalition agreement to agree on a new Israeli government. Now, what does will this new Israeli government look like if it will happen? What do they have in common? How can we even label them? Because they are not a left-wing or right-wing government, because what you will see is they represent everything from the right through to the left to the Islamists. They call themselves the Change Bloc. The only thing they really have in common is that they want to get rid of Benjamin Netanyahu as prime minister. That is literally the only thing that actually all of them agree on. It is a coalition of 8 parties, although we know of at least one defector from Yamina already, and there may be more. reaching from the right of Yamina, Naftali Bennett's party, Yesh Atid and Kachol Lavan, two centrist parties. Kachol Lavan, relatively new player, been around, well, this was the third election. And Yesh Atid somewhat more established. In the last election, they ran together. They had a terrible falling out with each other because Benny Gantz, who was the leader of Kachol Lavan, decided to join the coalition with Benjamin Netanyahu, as he felt that Israel really needed a government. So two centrist parties. Then Israel Beitenu, it's the party by Avigdor Lieberman, started off as the Russian party. Avigdor Lieberman has a very strong Russian accent in Hebrew, very secular, but quite right-wing when it comes to questions of the settlements, very progressive when it comes to questions of religion and state, for example. So has always been an interesting player, is highly respected as being principled, and forfeited a chance to join the Netanyahu coalition last time because of the ultra-Orthodox parties, because they didn't assent to his demands. Then Avodah, the Israeli Labor Party, we'll talk some more about them in a moment as well. New Hope, it's a new party, new in this election, Gideon Sa'ar, primarily defectors from the Likud who wanted to get rid of Netanyahu. So they were seen as politically, basically more or less Netanyahu, slightly to the right, probably. On some issues, quite liberal. Interestingly, had as part of their as part of the coalition agreement to legalize cannabis. So in that sense, quite liberal. On the other hand, for example, on things like asylum issues, very conservative. Gideon Sa'ar speaks about asylum seekers only as infiltrators. He doesn't call them asylum seekers; he calls them infiltrators. So, certainly not someone where we would say to the left. But then we do have Meretz, who are really the left to the far left of Israeli politics. First time in, I think, 20 years that Meretz enters a government. Quite extraordinary. Run on a platform very much about against annexation, in favor of LGBT rights. Against annexation, Yamina ran on a platform in favor of annexation. Ram, the Islamists, ran on a platform against LGBT rights. So you're already seeing like the fact that they really don't have very much in common. Together, they have, as of now, it appears 61 seats. The opposition might pick off a couple more Yamina politicians. We shall see. But we know that the joint list has already said that if it comes to it, they will vote in favor of the government to allow it to go ahead. They haven't signed a coalition agreement, but they said. So at the moment, it looks like this government will be sworn in. Now, interestingly, when we look at this, the normal theory would be that we would have a prime minister from Yesh Atid. It's the party with the largest number of seats, 17 in that block, significantly less than Likud with 30. But no, we are going to have a prime minister from the party that has 7 seats, Yamina's 6 + 1. And actually one of them has defected. So now only 6 seats probably, which is unbelievably unheard of in Israeli politics. So at the moment in this proposal, the next prime minister will be Naftali Bennett from Yamina, followed on a rotation agreement by Yair Lapid, who is the head of Yesh Atid. So the first 2 years, Naftali Bennett will be prime minister, with Yair Lapid being the foreign minister. And then Naftali Bennett will become the interior minister and Yair Lapid will become prime minister. Now, everyone you ask is in absolute agreement this government will not survive 2 years. So it is extremely unlikely that Yair Lapid will become prime minister. Why is he agreeing to this? Because he is hoping that it will make him look like he has the material to be prime minister. And if there is another election, he will do much better. It was the only way that he could pull the government together. Yamina said clearly, we're not going to join this government if Naftali Bennett isn't going to be prime minister. It is an unusual situation, but this is where we're at. These are the party leaders of the other political parties, only one woman amongst them, Merav Michaeli, the head of the Labour Party. This is Benny Gantz of Kachol Lavan, Gideon Sa'ar of New Hope, Avigdor Lieberman of Israel Beitenu, Nitzan Horowitz of Meretz, and Mansour Abbas of Ram, which we've already seen. Benny Gantz is going to be next defense minister, not a surprise. He's a retired general. Merav Michaeli, transport minister. Interesting choice. We'll come back why that might be interesting to us. Avigdor Lieberman, finance minister. The first time in a very long time that we will not have an ultra-Orthodox finance minister. Also, big, big, big change for us. Ayelet Shaked from Yamina will begin her 2 years as the interior minister and then become justice minister. Definitely one of the things that we should be concerned about. She has made her career out of trying to dismantle the judiciary and undermine the Supreme Court. So definitely something we need to look out for. Gideon Sa'ar will begin as justice minister and then will become foreign minister. Nitzan Horowitz from Meretz will become health minister. Yifat Shasha Biton will be education minister. Omar Bar-Lev, public security minister. There will be many, 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 many ministers because that's what happens when you have 8 parties that you give. So I've only given you the highlights here, but otherwise we're not going to get through this presentation. And I see there's a good question that I will talk about in just a moment as well. There was another election just last week on Wednesday, namely a presidential election. The new president of the State of Israel, who will be sworn in, I believe, on the 8th of July. I think he's, or whatever the Friday is, or whatever the Thursday is, because the other one is stepping down on a Friday, which is Shabbat, so they're swearing him in early. Is a new president, Yitzhak Bougie Herzog. Definitely positive news for us. He used to be the leader of the opposition for the Labour Party, is up to now the head of the Jewish Agency for Israel, the chairman of the Jewish Agency for Israel, has a very good understanding of the diaspora, has in the past said some things that we might find problematic. So he said some pretty negative things about intermarriage, for example, but has been very willing to learn, is a very, very good, reliable partner, and sort of gets religious pluralism and understands the importance of the Jewish diaspora very, very much, which is all good news for us. Now, what does this new government mean for religious pluralism? Well, a number of things. For the first time ever, we have a member of Knesset who is a Reform rabbi. Rabbi Gilad Kariv was just elected as one of the ministers of Knesset for the Labour Party. Not only will we now have a Reform rabbi as a member of Knesset, but as a member of government. The coalition agreement is still being negotiated. It will be published on Friday. So we don't quite know yet which role he will have. There's some debate whether he might become the next minister of the diaspora, which would be a very interesting and very positive for us. He's a good friend of mine, so I know he wants to be the He wants to be the head of the Budget and Finance Committee because it's a much more important political role. But we shall see how the negotiations go for him there. For us, it would be wonderful to have him as a minister of the diaspora because he really understands the diaspora very well. He was, until he became a member of Knesset, the chief executive of the Reform movement in Israel. What this new coalition agreement will mean for certain is good news for what is called the Kotel Agreement, the Western Wall Agreement, which was an agreement that was first agreed in 2015, 2016, which said that there should be a third section at the Western Wall for egalitarian prayer, which is equal in prominence to the men's and women's section. At the moment, if you want to have egalitarian prayers at the Western Wall, you have to literally, I always say they show you the door before you get in. You have to literally walk through a gate which says exit on the top, into the archaeological site, down some steps to a small little platform, which doesn't even quite reach the wall directly, although there are some steps to the wall. And that's the area, which is really not very clearly not equally prominent. The agreement was initially signed by Benjamin Netanyahu, but was suspended in 2017 because of pressure of the ultra-Orthodox parties who threatened to abandon the government and make the government collapse. All of the parties that have signed on to this agreement, except for Ram, who've never shown any real interest in the matter, have in the past pledged to support the Kotel Agreement. Even Yamina, actually the current platform that we have thanks to Naftali Bennett. We always joke that we had to wait for the settler politician to be in charge of it because they know how you do these things. You just create facts on the ground. And without even applying for planning permission, he just built the platform. He just had the platform built when he was the minister. I can't remember when he was the Minister of Diaspora Affairs, I think. He just had some bulldozers come and put the platform there. So even he has been in the past a great supporter. So the likelihood that this will go ahead is quite high. Although I would say the current tensions around the Temple Mount might delay the process because any construction work at the site might be perceived by the Waqf of the Temple Mount as trying to threaten the status quo on the Temple Mount. And there might be protests from that side, but we wouldn't expect from the Israeli government side, if this government does get sworn in on Sunday, further protests. Merav Michaeli as transport minister is an interesting opportunity. The reason why transport is very political in Israel is public transportation on Shabbat. And we might see some progress there. Unlikely to see that in every city there will be public transport on Shabbat, but we will probably see much more progress in that regard. There is a good chance that there will be state funding for rabbis of all streams. With Avigdor Lieberman in the finance ministry, it might mean that actually the state funding question will make greater progress. At the moment, some of the reform rabbis are paid for the state, but it's the minority, whereas really almost all Orthodox rabbis are paid for by the state, get their state salaries. So we might see some progress in this regard, which would be great progress in terms of reducing the amount of institutional discrimination that progressive Jews experience still in the state of Israel. I put SOHA here. SOHA, I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, is a modern Orthodox rabbinic association. It was set up also in protest to the chief rabbinate by more open-minded, primarily national religious, so associated with the settler movement, rabbis who felt that the stringency of the chief rabbinate actually meant that people who wanted to be Jews and engaged with Judaism were pushed out. What it says in the coalition agreement is that they will no longer only consult with the chief rabbinate on questions of religion, but will also consult with SOHA. It is a first step. It's not quite yet saying we're going to consult with all streams, but once the monopoly is broken, that is an interesting step towards religious pluralism. And we shall see what happens. They have, for example, an alternate kashrut certification system. Also, they do conversions and marriages. So there's a question around there. So it will hopefully help. SOHA, there are a number of SOHA rabbis who are willing to co-officiate with Reform rabbis because they have the state authority and the Reform rabbi doesn't. So it's a positive move in the right direction for us. This was not supposed to say conversation, but conversion. I don't know where the conversation came from. Conversion, there was very recently a Supreme Court ruling because the state failed to clarify what the status of those individuals is who converted in the state of Israel and then wanted to apply for citizenship under the law of return. Because the government didn't clarify the law, the Supreme Court stepped in and said these conversions must be recognized for with regards to the law of return. So all of the converts are eligible for citizenship. One of the fears was that if the Orthodox parties would be in the next government, they had announced that they would bring in legislation to reverse that. We're unlikely to see any legislation. So in respect to conversion, that's great news. Civil marriage, there is no civil marriage in Israel. It's a big topic because it means there's also therefore no equal marriage, so no LGBT marriage. But likewise, there's no possibility in Israel to marry if not both partners are of the same religion. Because you can only have a Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, or Baha'i, or Hindu wedding, but you can't have a mixed faith marriage. We're very unlikely to see any progress with this government. They are never going to agree on it. It's probably Ram would block it, and they're probably likely to have a veto. Around LGBTQ issues, we might see some progress. It's very difficult to see because Ram is really a homophobic party. They have many policies that are very openly homophobic. The question is, how much will they care? There's clear agreement that what Ram really cares about is the fact that they've managed to negotiate very, very healthy budgets for their Arab neighborhoods, which are desperately needed, and that probably they will not really pay that much attention. The big LGBT questions on the table are around surrogacy rights and adoption rights, rather than kind of individual rights. Israel has very good anti-discrimination laws, for example, already, but questions around surrogacy and adoption are big issues. We don't know if Ram is going to care enough to block it or not. So those were the issues that I came up with that might be of interest to us. I'm going to stop my screen share because I want to make sure that I can respond to the question that was posed, and then do feel free to ask other questions as well. So the question that we have in the chat, I'm just going to read it out because I don't think the people on YouTube can see the chat. Is please can you say something about attitudes towards Israel within the worldwide reform movement? People often say that Reform Jews are less Zionist than people in more traditional communities, that they don't see Israel as so central to their Judaism, and that Zionism conflicts with universalistic values in reform. Is that true? Also, are there differences from nation to nation? So what I can definitely tell you is there are huge differences from nation to nation. In general, what we see is we see almost no difference in attitude towards Israel between Reform and more traditional communities in countries where Reform Jews are a small minority. So I think in places like Germany, France, Hungary, we don't really see in any way significant differences. There are some countries, probably more the Anglo-speaking countries, where we do see more nuance in the Reform Jewish community. Now, the reason why I'm sort of hesitant to say, does that mean we're less Zionist, is I don't think that is what Zionism is about. Zionism isn't a uniform ideology. Zionism is a very broad political tent. I can tell you that every party that is represented at the Zionist Congress is passionately Zionist, and we disagree very, very much on very, very, very many issues, often, unfortunately, not in the most polite way. Unfortunately, the World Zionist Organization is not exactly known for being gentlemanlike in their debates. So I had things thrown at me in the past. I've been called all sorts of terrible names. Unfortunately, there are also people more from our political side who also call the other side horrible names. And throw things at them. So it's not really that the right wing behaves worse than the left wing. It's just often a bit of a zoo. So it is a very broad tent. I think sometimes the Reform Zionism is more complex than a simple right-wing centrist Zionism. There's a very comfortable, but I find not very attractive option of just saying Zionism is supporting whatever government Israelis elect. That is a position you can hold, but I don't really think it makes any sense for us as political human beings, because actually we shouldn't abandon all the values that we have about our reality in this country, for example, and say, but when they do it in Israel, that's fine. So for me, because I'm a passionate Zionist and I care deeply about asylum seeker issues, I care deeply about asylum seeker issues in this country, I care deeply about asylum seeker issues in Germany. My family has both my parents are political refugees. My mother fled from communist Eastern Germany with her parents. My father fled from communist Czechoslovakia to Germany. So I'm the child of political refugees. I have great sympathy for the plight of political refugees. I don't feel like I'm doing justice to my Zionist dream if I would abandon those values when it comes to the state of Israel. And therefore, I was very critical of politicians like Gideon Sa'ar. In fact, if you Google me, the one thing, my only time that I made the #1 news article of the Jewish Chronicle was when I walked out in protest out of a Zionist Federation dinner where Gideon Sa'ar spoke when he called asylum seekers infiltrators and claimed that Israel was not making plans to deport them to third countries, which really was just a lie. So I don't believe, but I don't think that makes me less of a Zionist. And in many ways, I think it makes me a much more engaged Zionist. Because I actually care. I really, really deeply care. I spend a lot of time thinking about all the issues that are at stake in Israel. I do think there is an element, and we see it less in the in the mainstream Orthodox, although we see it much more in the Haredi community, of kind of, we're just not interested. Like it's just a little bit too complicated, or, you know, we'll wait for the Messiah in the ultra-Orthodox community. But the ultra-Orthodox community really has, by and large, been anti-Zionist, or at least non-Zionist in most countries around the world. So it's a complicated answer, maybe. But I think sometimes we feel as progressive Jews that we just can't talk about Israel, and therefore we don't feel, because we're afraid of arguments. I see this a lot. Very many of my colleagues say they would not preach on Israel. Many rabbis don't like preaching on Israel because they're afraid of upsetting people, which of course means that also our congregants don't really feel comfortable talking, which means that we lose the ability to hear nuanced views and understand each other. And when something happens, all we can do is shout at each other, which is really not very helpful. So I firmly believe that the only answer is for us to talk more about Israel, and everyone who's still willing to argue about it, I believe, still cares. And I think there are very, very many people in Reform congregations, just as many as there are in United Synagogue congregations, who are looking at Israel, and it matters to them, and it matters to them for very many reasons. I hope that was a bit of a satisfactory answer, but you can come in and discuss with me also. So please feel free also to respond. I don't just have to lecture you. Yeah, Alex.
May I ask, I hear what you say, it's very interesting. I also observe that Reform rabbis are reluctant to talk about Israel for fear of offending people in their congregation. How might this be, it's not resolved, that's not quite, how might there be some kind of movement towards feeling more comfortable? It must be very difficult for the rabbis.
So I think it is difficult for the rabbis. I think rabbis need training. So one of the things, for example, that I do is, and in a few weeks' time, I'm teaching at the Leo Baeck College rabbinic students a whole morning on how can we speak about Israel in congregations. I think from my personal experience, what I would say, first of all, it's very important as a congregational rabbi to learn that sometimes we believe things, right? We are also individuals, that sometimes we believe things, but if we say them in certain ways, we basically already put a block in front of people, and people stop being able to hear us. That sometimes we need to, one of the reasons, for example, why I speak about the disputed territory is, even though I do have a clear view of what I believe where in that dispute I stand, is that I feel it's more helpful for a conversation, because actually I do believe that we are entitled to have alternative views. And I, as a rabbi, have to model that, yes, I as an individual have a view, but that doesn't mean I disrespect someone who might have a view more to the right or more to the left. And it's one of the things that I say to people, for example, who say, well, we need to talk about apartheid. And I say, well, maybe we should talk about apartheid. Maybe that is actually an important conversation. But I can tell you, if you want to have that conversation of what the challenge of apartheid means, if you use the word apartheid, you've lost the entire audience that doesn't already agree with you. So if you want to have a conversation about the actual issue, have a conversation about what does it mean that one law applies when it comes to the disputed territories, that one law applies to Israeli citizens there and another law applies to Palestinians who do not have citizenship, right? Don't talk about apartheid, talk about the actual issues. What does that mean for the situation? So I think some of it is about skills. I think the other thing that I feel really strongly is that one of the things I feel really strongly about is that, especially when we as rabbis talk about controversial issues related to Israel, we must give congregants an opportunity to respond. So that it's not just because I have the pulpit, I get to tell you what's happening. Because actually most rabbis are no more experts on Israel than their congregants. And therefore, while we did do 5 years of studying Talmud and we are allowed to lecture you on Talmud, most rabbis are not experts on Israeli politics or Israeli history. And therefore, actually, our role is primarily to facilitate a conversation and initiate a conversation. So, for example, for me, the last time I spoke about Israel, when it was quite controversial, it was after the Kaddish for Gaza. I decided to preach about the moment of the Kaddish for Gaza on Yom Kippur. I had announced in advance that the slot of the study session immediately after the Yom Kippur morning service where I was preaching was going to be an opportunity for everyone else to respond, where I was going to listen and where we were going to listen to each other. And I think modeling those things helps us to create an atmosphere of dialogue where we can agree that we don't all agree. Okay, what is the percentage of Jews in the UK who claim to belong to Reform, Progressive, Liberal vision of Judaism, of Jews in the UK? I'm not 100% sure on the latest statistic. Probably something like 30%, is that right? I don't know. Anyone better on the statistics? What was the last study in terms of religious affiliation? I can't remember exactly. I think of affiliated Jews were about a third, but I don't know for certain. Sorry, not a statistician.
No, I think we need to wait for also the results of the census, and then we'll have another census within the Jewish world. Perhaps one question that is around here is the question of racism or the situation of really refugees in Israel. It was for a long time a hot topic, and I think through the election years, the past two really came to a non-talk in Israel. You feel that it is a topic which comes back or has totally lost its political relevance in the political arena?
It is still a topic. It's and Israel has seen in the last 10 years certainly an increase in incidences of racism. We see, I mean, there's a very good project. The Reform Movement is actually a key partner in this project that runs a helpline where you can report incidences of racism. There are sadly also many, I mean, the people who suffer the most racism are actually Arabs in the transportation industry. Taxi drivers and bus drivers really are by far the largest numbers of victims of racism. And sometimes very horrible cases of racism, almost lynchings, and so on. But also Jews experience racism, Ethiopian Jews, so Black Jews, but also Russian-speaking Jews, even French Jews report regular racism. So racism has been an issue in Israeli society. I think the asylum seeker issue is an interesting question. What was interesting is that actually very quietly, all the asylum seekers were able to access vaccines, for example. even though many of them are not registered. It remains that there is no registration. I suspect with this new government, we will not see any progress in either direction. They will neither make a move to expel asylum seekers, which kind of would be Gideon Saar's approach, but nor will they do what Meretz and Avodah have supported, which is actually a positive resolution of the asylum seeker issue. Very interestingly, the asylum seeker issue was one of the issues where the Jewish Agency for Israel spoke out very clearly and spoke out against the government, which the Jewish Agency does very rarely also. But a number of years, we passed a resolution at the Board of Governors of the Jewish Agency that called on the Israeli government to follow examples of best practice from around the world for dealing and hearing asylum cases, and included a call on the Israeli government to immediately give citizenship to all asylum seekers who had arrived, who were underage when they arrived, with an offer that the Jewish Agency would provide its absorption and immigration resources to the government. That never was accepted by the government, so neither did they get citizenship, nor did they kind of cash in on the Jewish Agency, which was probably a good thing, because I'm not sure where the Jewish Agency would have found the money, really, because since I've been on the board, we've cut our budget every year. But in any case, so I think we will just not see any progress in either direction. There's some very good civic society organizations that do fantastic work with asylum seekers, and actually something we can be proud of. The former British ambassador to Israel, Matthew Gould, his wife used to be very, very active in supporting asylum seekers in Tel Aviv. She started, together with the wife of the American ambassador, a number of really fantastic initiatives. So some really great work. Yes, definitely, Corinne, you're absolutely right. Racism towards Sephardi Jews, still very much a topic. Moroccan Jews, very much a problem. In terms of the question, were we able to come to a consensus view on the Kaddish for Gaza? No, we are a congregation like any other. I have a very broad tent. I mean, we are kind of in Tory heartland, but that doesn't mean I have a few Corbinites in my congregation. We were not able to come to a consensus, but in a sense, I didn't really mind that we weren't able to come to a consensus. What I was really proud of, and I think there was some power of doing it on Yom Kippur, was that we managed to have a conversation where everyone heard the other side. Even if we didn't agree with each other, at least we heard each other, and maybe we understood a little bit more about why people were in agreement or were against. The overwhelming majority in my congregation was quite offended by the Kaddish for Gaza and really very upset by it. That was definitely the overwhelming majority. Doesn't mean that there weren't individuals who were very sympathetic towards it. Yes.
There is a very interesting question. I think that is, once again, can we be Zionist, or what is our Zionist way of in the diaspora? Is if a non-Brit said that we were wrong to vote for Brexit, I would object and say it's not, none of your business. What right do I have to have an opinion on what Israel's doing or not doing? And that is a question by Andrew and Paula.
So I think that it's a good question. It's a very good question. I think the reason is the Declaration of the State of Israel, which says it is the State of Israel is created to be a home for the Jewish people. It does not say to be a home for the citizens of the State of Israel. It says to be a home for the Jewish people. And the State of Israel has always said we are not just a state of our citizens, we are also a state of the Jewish people. It is one of the reasons why when the state was founded, the national institutions were not dismantled, because it was felt that it was important that the diaspora community had a voice in the sort of governmental affairs of the state. And just to illustrate kind of what that means is the chair of the World Zionist Organization has a grave reserve with the prime ministers of the state of Israel on Mount Herzl. So it's not seen as kind of second class, and the heads of department of the World Zionist Organization, when there are official state functions, they sit in the front row with the ministers of the Knesset. And literally the only mandates these people have are the mandates that Jews from around the world have given them. So I think the state of Israel defines itself slightly different. It's not unique in that there are other countries around the world that have a very strong relationship with its diaspora, but it is different to sort of being a non-Brit, saying something about Brexit. So I think because Israel claims to be a home for all of us, we also have a right to say it. And Nat Hoffman, the director of the Israel Religious Action Center, always says Israel is far too important to leave it to just the Israelis. So that would be my answer to that. Claudia, yeah.
Yeah, as part of your, or let's say, Reform or liberal rabbis' pastoral duties to their congregants, I'm thinking about sort of university students and maybe also secondary students who are, they have to deal with this problem of their fellow university students saying that Zionism is racism, and, they're feeling that, anti-Zionism is really anti-Semitism. And so, you can't really it's impossible for rabbis, if they're sort of looking after their young congregants, to ignore all of this Zionism. And they really need to, I think, guide the young people in the congregation as to, how they should answer to these fellow students.
It's quite tricky, though, for most colleagues. Most colleagues don't really know the answers themselves necessarily. I mean, I think this is part of why I'm saying it's really important that we train rabbis. I mean, a lot of the time, for example, I do a lot of work with Jewish students also. For example, I helped the Sheffield Jewish Student Society passed a resolution to say, actually Jews are not responsible for anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism as a problem has nothing to do with there being a conflict with the Palestinians. It was a very strong resolution. I helped the students formulate it. I'm a person. I'm most of the time I just act as a resource person. I firmly believe that it's important to understand, to help the students formulate their own position rather than to tell them what they should be saying, because they often understand the people who are leveling accusations against them much better than I understand it. And they might be able to come up with much better answers. And depending on what the challenges are, sometimes, it's better for a more right-wing person to become the spokesperson, but sometimes it's exactly the more left-wing who can sympathize with 99% of the views who is the best spokesperson. And I try to give young people advice of how to be political about these things and how to figure out with their friends that, even if they don't have a joint view on Israel, how can they be most strategic in being able to have their views heard and be protected. So there's an important pastoral duty. I don't think every rabbi necessarily has to do it by themselves. It's okay to call on colleagues. It's like like I'm not an expert in everything, and I call on colleagues for help in certain areas. So that's really important. I'm going to just what will the new government focus on? But passing a budget, really simple answer. Their only hope is passing a budget. If they manage to pass a budget, they will have achieved something that Bibi Netanyahu hasn't achieved for quite some time. It's the number one thing that they will be trying. Everything else will probably not make very much progress, and potentially after the budget is passed, the government will collapse. We'll see. We don't know the coalition agreement yet, so we'll know a little bit more on Friday, but probably not so very much. They really don't have anything in common, these parties, so it'll make it very difficult to govern together. The element of justice in the prophets and how much of this is present in the thinking of religious Jews. I think there's a lot of that present in the thinking of religious Jews. I always try to even though I'm definitely not, I would not be voting Yamina if I were a voter in Israel. But actually, I do think they are driven by a sense of justice and calling, and they are not, they might hold political positions that I disagree with, but they're not evil racists. They're not Ben Gvir or any of the other, like Otzma Yehudit, which are the sort of the Kahanists who are really like racists and Jewish supremacists. Yamina are not that. I think a lot of it, actually going into politics in Israel is not like the thing that you do because, you know, you want to have an easy life and be famous and a good salary. I mean, it pays okay, but there are many, many jobs you can do that pay much better. And it doesn't get you a lot of respect. In general, politicians are not well regarded. Most people go into it because they deeply believe it. I mean, you know, Gilad Kariv, I remember I said to him, he wasn't going to even run in this election, actually. Merav Michaeli called him to ask him to run. But I remember the last election he ran, but he didn't run the one before, but the one before that where he ran, I said to him, why are you doing this to yourself? You know, every time you take a 6-month sabbatical, unpaid, you work like 24/7, just for people to write horrible things about you. And he said, because I've always dreamt of making a real difference in the state of Israel. And in the end, the only way I can really do that is by being a member of Knesset. And I actually think, you know what, I think a lot of the politicians, even those whose political views I don't share, do go into this with a sense of, actually, I have a vision. I do believe in the state of Israel and the best foot of the state of Israel and want the best for its citizens. So I think it is there. Sometimes we don't recognize it. You know, there are some things where we struggle deeply, and it's one of the things that I really try to reflect on. That, you know, there are rabbis that really teach horrible, racist, homophobic things from our most sacred texts, and I can't say that they're not Jewish or not genuinely trying to interpret our text. I think they're deeply wrong, but actually, and I think they're politically dangerous, and I think a state has a different role to interfere with that. And luckily, for example, one of the people who was not allowed to run in the Knesset was a rabbi who actually the Supreme Court ruled was not allowed to become a candidate in the Knesset because of all the racist things he had said and written. Actually, the Reform movement brought that case to the Supreme Court to ban him from running in the Knesset. It was listed as one of the 10 most important cases that the Supreme Court heard in that year. Very, very important. 10 years of work of tracking this rabbi's writing and speeches and YouTube videos. Horrible. some of the things were horrible. Some of the things we saw in the campaign were horrible. Literally, progressive Jews, we were compared to dogs in some of the adverts that the Orthodox parties ran. They said, if you let Reform Jews anywhere near the Knesset, they'll start bar mitzvahing dogs. And, they're no better than dogs. That was not nice, some not nice things. So, but I do believe those are the minority. And I think it is deeply unfair when people pick on saying, Israel is now racist because two racists got into the government. Well, I've got news for you. If that's the bar to being racist, then sadly, most countries around the world are racist countries because, but it's 2 out of 120. What's important is, will they get a big forum or will they not get a big forum? And will they be perceived as speaking for the people, or will they actually be just what they are, a minority? The word Arzenu does mean something. Arzenu means our country. So this is where our name comes from. Arzenu, it's our country. I think was chosen very. It came initially. It in the States. It's Arza because it's a great. It acts both as an acronym and as a word. Arza means towards the land, and is also the Association of Reform Zionists of America. Arza. And ProZion was in the beginning progressive Zionists. The reason why we kind of dropped the use of ProZion is that the students said they found it really difficult on campus because the word Zion immediately raised so many flags. And I know that's maybe not a good reason to change a name, but actually it really didn't resonate anymore with people. And so the decision was to just go, like most countries around the world, with Arzenu. I'm going to hand over to Adrian. I'm very good because I'm German. Adrian knows this. Adrian told me I have to be done by 9 o'clock. It's 3 minutes to 9.
Now it's also now I'm in the spotlight of being the evil one.
No. I was always going to finish because I'm very German.
I know. There are a lot of things we have in common, and where our congregations have to suffer a little bit because of us. But look, it was very interesting to see you, to have that chat, and I think one of the wonderful things is of Zoom that it even can bring the north and the south of London together in one evening. So once again, really thank you for sharing your view, giving us an idea of Arzenu's role in the UK and in a worldwide as a movement, but also to help to dream of Israel that is shaped by our values. And I think that is one of the most important things when we think about Zionism. The dream is not, or we don't have to stop dreaming only because there is a state of Israel. The ideas and the values of Zionism are still very much something that calls all of us to action. And if I may, I can also do a little membership drive for Arzenu. You can become a member of Arzenu here in the UK. And I will make sure that in our next e-Zine, we will share the link how you can become a supporter and a member of Arzenu. You get another newsletter, I think. But
also, not very regularly, unfortunately. I'm not responsible for Arzenu UK anymore because I have my international hat, and our chair just left. So you won't be bombarded with newsletters. Don't worry. And I think we only cost about £15 a year or something.
But it's, I think, also a wonderful way also to show commitment and that you care for the state of Israel. thank you again, Leah. That was a very important talk, I think, also in our congregational journey, but also we had many guests from the South London Israel Forum here with us this evening, and this gives me an opportunity also to say a big thank you to Judy, who chairs the Israel Committee of our congregation and the South London Israel Forum for organizing and for making sure that it is not forgotten. So we battled a little bit with the time and when we do it, but finally we had the meeting and this session. So good night to all of you, and dream your dreams about Israel. And for those who are attending our services, it's Parashat Korach. So that also reminds us sometimes we need to strive for the right understanding, and as long as it is for the sake of heaven, we're on the right path.
You know, there was a sinkhole in Jerusalem this week.
Yes.
And, I mean, it's terrible. Like, really, luckily nobody got hurt. It was in the car park, but several cars disappeared at Hadassah Hospital in a sinkhole just to coincide with Parashat Korach and the swearing in of a new Israeli government.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I
very
add-
much, and,
Thank you, dear. Really
thank you.
interesting.